gentlemen, would you please make welcome Associate Professor Bronwyn Gillanders.
Thank you for that introduction, Russell. Okay, I'm just going to point out that I'm actually going to focus more on the biological aspects and leave all the oceanographic work to Joachim. So just to give you a brief outline of my presentation, I'm going to briefly mention some of the marine organisms in Spencer Gulf. Obviously, the one organism that's dear to my heart is the giant Australian cuttlefish, and we've heard in the BHP Billiton DVD some basic information about it, so I'll briefly give you a bit more of an introduction to the species, explain to you why I think it is so unique, mention some of the work that we've been doing on desalination brine, and this was largely started because BHP wouldn't release the outcomes of their ecotoxicology work at the time. I'm then going to focus a little bit on the inbound migration, so the potential movement of cuttlefish onto that reef habitat, because I believe this is something that's been largely ignored in the EIS. And I'm also going to mention some of the data that's out there suggesting where they're found at different times prior to them the cuttlefish coming onto the reef. I'll briefly focus on some of the cuttlefish biomass and numbers, and then at the very end of the talk I'm going to have a slide each on snapper and sea urchins, and this largely relates to some of the work that's either been done by myself or a student in relation to snapper and some of the work from our research laboratory on sea urchins. So you may not be able to see this table very well, it's straight out of BHP EIS. I've simply put it there to illustrate that they suggest there's 8 species of cephalopods, so that's your squid, your cuttlefish, your octopus that occur in Upper Spencer Gulf, and yet recent trawl survey work suggests there's up to 23 species. This is just a simple example of the underestimation of potential species in this Upper Spencer Gulf region. The giant Australian cuttlefish, as no doubt you're all reasonably familiar with, can reach quite large sizes, up to 13 kilos, grow up to 1 metre, although you're unlikely to see them of this size here at Point Lowly. But they only live for 1 to 2 years. And this actually becomes critical when we start thinking about some of the potential impacts on the species. The distribution of the giant Australian cuttlefish is from Queensland right around the southern coastline to Ningaloo Reef in Western Australia. But probably one of the most interesting aspects of the biology of the species, as you're all aware, is that at this single location in Upper Spencer Gulf, it aggregates to breed. Now, Emma mentioned in the DVD that this is remarkable in Australian waters. It is globally unique. We do not find any other cuttlefish in the world that aggregates in these numbers to breed. And just to give you a perspective on it, out there off Point Lowly, we have about 1 cuttlefish per square metre of habitat. Elsewhere across the range of the species, we're lucky if we see 2 to 3 cuttlefish per 100 square metres. So it really is fairly spectacular. We hone into this region, we're talking about them aggregating to breed along this coastline here, and they pretty much come in between May and August, so they're not there for that long. Even within that region, it's this brown reef habitat that they're honing in on for laying their eggs. And I've really just included pictures here of the giant Australian cuttlefish. You can see some of the numbers here. They really are everywhere. They're there for one purpose, and that's reproduction. And you can see here some of the eggs on the underside of rocks. So in this breeding aggregation, the males are larger than the females. We know that there's a higher male to female sex ratio, and so what that means is that there's a lot of males out there trying to get the one female, and so the males are battling with each other, if you like, to get access to that particular female. also means that they have some quite interesting behaviours. They try and impersonate females and sneak matings. I think, as you'll see from these pictures, besides the biology and the behavioural aspects of this species, it really is the sheer numbers that are impressive. So for around 25 years, cuttlefish were fished at relatively low levels, and this graph here just shows the catch for the state waters over time, and they were fished at low levels primarily as bait for the snapper fishery, and in the mid-1990s we all decided they were pretty good eating, and we started eating things like calamari, and so at that point in time the breeding aggregation was hammered somewhat from the commercial fisheries, which is why in mid-1998 we had a seasonal closure placed on this region here, so out from Point Lowly to the Port Bonython jetty and across to BHP jetty over here in Whyalla. And that is now a permanent restriction, and at this point in time, back in about the mid 2002, 2003 is when I became involved in some of the work on the giant Australian cuttlefish, largely wanting to have a scientific basis for a management plan in relation to the commercial fishing of the species. Obviously, since then, there's been other environmental issues that have become more important. So we were interested in looking at the population structure. So we know this species occurs right around southern Australia, but what sort of input is there? Is it one large intermixing population such that if we fish out or remove individuals through an impact from one area, they'll be replaced from elsewhere? And that's largely where we started looking at the genetic population structure along with a few other aspects of the biology. So we have the coastline of Australia. We found evidence not just for one large interbreeding population, but for in fact 5 different populations across the species range, with 3 of these actually occurring in South Australia. So here we have a population that's in Gulf of St Vincent and southern Spencer Gulf, another one that's in the west coast bays of South Australia, and the breeding aggregation actually being very distinct from elsewhere. Now, just to summarise that information, this shows that it's not evidence, no evidence for one large intermixing population, which is going to have some implications for if there's any impact on the population in northern Spencer Gulf. The breeding aggregation does differ from elsewhere, and we believe that this has both evolutionary and ecological implications. We do believe we've got the evidence that the Upper Spencer Gulf population is actually a new species, and it's in the process of speciation. Now, one of the reasons it may have speciated is to do with the strong environmental gradient along the Gulf regions. But whatever the reason is, it's relatively recent and rapid, and again, I'll show you a little bit more information shortly. But of critical importance to any proposed desalination plant is that there's likely to be no input from southern Spencer Gulf populations if there's any damage to this Upper Spencer Gulf one. This shows you here what the coastline was like 20,000 years ago. So we're up here, and you can see it would have been dry land then. So what we're thinking is that this particular Upper Spencer Gulf population has diverged in the last 7,000 years. Now, that may sound like a relatively long time to some of you, but in terms of evolutionary processes, that's relatively short. So in the last 7,000 years, we have a new species.